Carolyn Forché is the author of 5 volumes of poetry, and What You Have Heard Is True, a memoir of witness and resistance, which we spoke about last year at Miami Book Fair International. She's also the editor of 2 collections, Against Forgetting, 20th Century Poetry of Witness, and Poetry of Witness, The Tradition in English, 1500 to 2001. Since my own literary and poetic awakening in the early 1990s, when I learned that literature was very much alive, Carolyn Forché's work became a touchstone for me and an indication of how there is magic not just in poetry, but even in plain language, and how bearing witness to this life and one's willingness to learn how much there is to witness is a measure of how real a person can be and how much a person might be able to make a difference. Her latest collection, In the Lateness of the World, is full of elegies that both move and ground me and make me feel connected to her life. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for talking to me once again. I feel so spoiled.
Thank you very much for having me back.
So it's been a while since you've released a collection of poetry. I presume there probably was plenty of writing in that time, including the writing of your memoir. But can you talk a little bit about how this collection was put together?
Well, I am a slow writer. Usually a decade passes between my books anyway, but 17 years, I agree, is a little excessive. It's been 17 years since my most
The
recent.
book is great, so it's right on time, but I do want to know the story.
um, okay. The oldest poem in the collection was written in 2004. And the most recent several poems were written in the past year before the book was published, the year before. So they span a 17-year period. Now, there are a lot of poems that I wrote in that time that do not appear in this collection because they didn't make the cut for me. I didn't want them. I have a lot of writing that never sees the light of day. I keep it in boxes in various places. But when I started putting this collection together, it was the publisher was decided to publish it after the memoir, so it waited even longer, which was a good thing because I wrote some newer poems for it during that time. And so rather than being a book length work with a theme that's obvious or explicit, it's really a collection of poems written over a period of time, which is rather old-fashioned approach. But when I assembled the book and began ordering it and thinking about it, I realized how much these poems were conversing, how much they were in dialogue with each other, and how many echoes there were over that long stretch of time. How many motifs and details occur and recur that are in poems years apart. And I began to feel that there was a subliminal subject, several of them moving through the work. And of course, it's a very elegiac volume. I wrote many poems in it to people who are dead and whom I've lost. But there's also a tone, an elegiac tone, I think, about the whole world in it. But it's also celebratory, and I hope that the reader can come away with a feeling of hope, of endurance, of looking forward. It's a book of having passed through many things. While I was writing this book, I had a number of difficulties. I had cancer and cancer treatments, and water destroyed my house, and there were many things that happened. And so I think some of that is reflected in not so much in the imagery and the stories, but in the sensibility that is at work in the book. So I decided that it was legitimately a complete collection on its own, and that it did say something beyond what the discrete individual poems do. There was something going on with it that was kind of magical for me when I discovered it. And since I've published it, other people have noticed things that I didn't notice about it.
Well, that is the joy and the terror, right, of publishing a book is now it belongs to the world, and Other people may find things and they might actually also be right, which is always interesting.
Because the poet knows the least, really, about the world.
Uh, that can certainly be the case. Yeah. I think, no matter how smart we are, there probably should be a certain level of naivete. I mean, that seems to be borne out by the idea. Like this book, it probably, it may be one of the most powerful thematic poetry collections I've ever read, but you didn't write it with that goal in mind, it sounds like. And
No,
so
it wrote
because
itself.
it happened organically, like it doesn't feel like, oh, if you use a theme for a poetry collection, sometimes that feels like homework. And then it feels like homework for the reader. Like, okay, technically, yes, I see how there's a through line, and if the book is charming enough, like I can either forgive it or I can actually care. And sometimes it's good, but it's really strongest when uh you write for a long time and you can sort of pick poems that aren't straining for the theme. And yeah, if it happens organically where um you can not necessarily always be fully aware of how the poems talk to each other.
Mhm. Well, they're reflective of the inner world, the inner life, and some of that is very unconscious. They're reflective of the sensibility of the, and so what emerges is something that is beyond what one can know about oneself.
And I think this may be one of the biggest things I'm wrestling with as a writer right now is planning versus just throwing myself upside down into a project. Because part of me thinks if I'm not planning enough, then I'm not preparing to give the reader enough. But on the other hand, if I'm not discombobulating myself enough or expanding myself enough, then like the plan maybe isn't worth it.
I think I'm going to vote for the latter. I think you should plunge in upside down and not know anything. I've gotten further and further away from planning in my writing life. Although planning planning enters when you're in the revision process, or when you're shaping a book, or when you finally see what you have, and you begin to to make it better. One of the things that you can do to make it better is to make a kind of plan for how you think it should work. When you're with a poetry book, it's a matter of ordering the poems. And so you order and you change the order, and you spread the work around on the floor, and you walk. They say walk the book. You're walking around from poem to poem, picking one up and putting it down in a different place. And eventually the right order, you'll know it when it happens. The right order finally emerges. And in the prose book that I did, I found that I had all the writing, but I didn't have the structure until the very end. So the memoir doesn't begin, for example, at the beginning of the story. It begins quite well into it. And for the poetry book, uh, I never planned to begin with Museum of Stones. That was suggested to me by Ilya Kaminsky. I took his advice, and he was right. It is an invocation poem.
Mhm.
So,
And a poem of building.
yeah. And a poem of rubble, a poem of aftermath, a poem of what we can make of ruins.
I hinted in my introduction, like for me, I feel like I have a very personal relationship with you, even though we've met maybe twice before, and you've always been very kind and decent and just very normal to me.
Thank you.
But my attachment to your work, and and like I realize I have boundaries. I get that you are not your work, and that it's totally legit for me to have this like incredible pull, that I feel with your work. Uh, so reading so many elegies from you, um, yeah, I felt like I had to read the book in a certain way, like the boatman, which I think is a masterpiece. I had to go outside and read that in the sun, and I just needed to be like very bright and
And not cold.
experience the poem.
Not cold and not in the water. Yeah.
No, no. Uh, and yeah, thankfully here in Florida, I could stay nice and toasty even in October. But I felt like I needed the sunlight to read that, and then like the font on the page and just everything about the poem, like it just felt like I was a much younger person, even though I was reading material that I'm not sure a young person can fully grasp or touch upon. Having written one or two elegies myself, and every time I find myself writing a new one, part of me just goes, "Damn it, I don't want to do that." I was wondering if you'd be willing to read The Boatman.
Sure. Shall I tell you the story of how this poem came about?
Absolutely.
I'll begin with that because um, I had been in Greece for 7 summers, most of them on the island of Thasos in the northern Aegean, which is right near Lesbos. And Lesbos, where refugee camps are. And so I was very aware in recent years of the rescue efforts of the Aegean being turned into a watery tomb, of the hundreds or thousands of people capsizing into that water and drowning, trying to escape Libya, Syria, uh, many countries at war, Yemen, others trying to get to Europe, trying to get to safety. And then one winter, I went to teach at Marquette University in Milwaukee, and I was living in a hotel downtown, and I didn't have a car. So it was often bitterly cold. And when it was too cold to walk, I took a taxi. And one particular driver out of the hundreds of drivers in downtown Milwaukee kept being the one that would pull over and pick me up. And he even noticed, he said, "I've driven you before." And so then we started talking, and I asked him where he was from. He said, "I'm from Homs in Syria." And then by the time he pulled up to the hotel, it was snowing hard. And we sat in the cab with the engine running and the heat, with the snow falling all around us and piling on top of the cab. And he told me his story. And he said, I had told him that I was a poet teaching poetry at the university. And he said, "I'm only telling you this so that someday you will write it." He didn't ask me if I would. He just told me, "You will write it." So I had finally, I didn't know whether that would be possible because I never can write occasional poems, and I can't write in response to assignments about particular things. But one day this poem started to come, and much of the detail here is what he gave me during that snowy talk. The Boatman. "We were 31 souls," he said, "in the gray sick of sea, in a cold rubber boat, rising and falling in our filth. By morning, this didn't matter. No land was in sight. All were soaked to the bone, living and dead. We could still float," he said, "from war to war. What lay behind us but ruins of stone piled on ruins of stone? City called Mother of the Poor, surrounded by fields of cotton and millet, city of jewelers and cloak makers, with the oldest church in Christendom and the sword of Allah. If anyone remains there now, he assures, they would be utterly alone. There is a hotel named for it in Rome, 200 meters from the Piazza di Spagna, where you can have breakfast under the portraits of film stars. There, the staff cannot do enough for you. But I am talking nonsense again, as I have since that night we fetched a child, not ours, from the sea, drifting face down in a life vest, its eyes taken by fish or the birds above us. After that, Aleppo went up in smoke. and Raqqa came under a rain of leaflets warning everyone to go. Leave, yes, but go where? We lived through Americans and Russians, through Americans again, many nights of death from the clouds, mornings surprised to be waking from the sleep of death, still unburied and alive, with no safe place. Leave, yes, we'll obey the leaflets, but go where? To the sea, to be eaten? To the shores of Europe, to be caged? To Camp Misery and Camp Remain Here? I ask you then, where? You tell me you are a poet. If so, our destination is the same. I find myself now the boatman, driving a taxi at the end of the world. I will see that you arrive safely, my friend. I will get you there.
It's and it's more beautiful for how harsh so many of the details are, including rising and falling in our own filth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I
He gave me the details, but not in the, some of them were not in his wording, but there were details from him. My poetry just takes off at a gallop. It gets away from me when I'm writing, and it writes itself. But I think I'm very grateful to him because that poem was really a gift. And he did want it written. And I hope somehow finds it. I lost his card. So I don't even know the name of the taxi company. But I'm sure if I went back to Milwaukee and flagged a cab, it would be him.
One of my preoccupations with poetry is the sense of beauty and play that's required, even when, for example, in a story like this, which there's two levels. There's the witness of his experience and what he went through, and then there's the sort of metaphorical larger level, which is existentially what this means for all of us. And so for me, there's that tension between the seriousness of what it means when he says you have to write this, and you're saying I can't promise that I can actually write something that is commensurate with the story that you told me, but also the need to let your horses gallop, as it were, and in the writing of the poem. And I presume a lot of that balance probably gets worked out in revision, unless occasionally poems just come out perfect. But that's rare in my experience.
I don't remember how much I had to revise this, but I do remember the illuminating moment when I realized that here we were crossing the river Styx, and there was the ferryman, and
Mm-hmm.
he calls himself the boatman. So, and I don't know whether he was actually thinking about that, but it was amazing to him that he was driving a taxi cab while his world, was falling apart completely. Homs had been bombed to oblivion. And now that I'm reading it in the present, our world seems to be ending as well in many horrific ways. We hope it isn't. We hope we survive this, and I'm sure we will. But there is an air of foreboding that we feel.
Partly the politics in this country, and I don't want to get into a long political conversation about the specifics of what's happening in our country. We're recording this before the election, and maybe after the election we could have a vaguely pleasant conversation about it, maybe. But I saw on Facebook, where you occasionally appear, that one complaint I've seen from people is, The Democrats are never liberal enough, and they're always complaining, oh, well, we're just going to fall into fascism if we don't vote for whatever centrist they put up. And it's just irritating. And, if you look at what Hannah Arendt said, but it's like, but this time it might actually be fascism that people like. George W. Bush was embarrassing and, yes, authoritarian. There was a hint, at least, that the people he worked with cared about the Constitution and cared about democracy, even if they were a little shady around the edges. But, um, currently our leadership seems just pro-fascist all the way down the line. And the comment you had made, and I just remember thinking this is one of the ironies of social media, is when Carolyn Forché is telling you something, you should probably listen really hard. You're like, basically your comment was, I'm not sure you're ready for whatever a fascist leader has to offer.
I don't think Americans are prepared to live under fascism, but I also am heartened by the turnover in the White House and the present administration, because even though some of them left under very difficult terms, I took the ones that left voluntarily as signs that there were still people who weren't willing to go along with this. And so I was heartened by the turnover, but I will say that I shouldn't be surprised, but I am surprised at how many are willing to go along with it and willing to put their principles aside, and how many Americans lamentably don't see what's happening for what it is. So I think after the election, the conversation we'll have is either how do you learn to live with fascism quickly and to oppose it effectively, or how do we bring our country back to a place where people can see the truth for what it is, you know, can see what's in front of them and analyze it and critique it. Right now, there's a strange kind of malaise. It seems to be, people have called it cultish, and I think that's true. And I don't know what the cure for that is. You have to be deprogrammed from a cult. So how to do that on a mass scale? I mean, I have ideas, but you wouldn't be able to do them. I would pour money into education for one thing, and I would probably do what Canada and Britain have done with Fox and just not allow them to broadcast, because they consider them entertainment shows that are posing as news shows, but they are essentially propaganda. So they're not allowed to
Yes.
be broadcast. And I would do that to them here, I have to say. Not afraid to say that. I think that they're responsible for a lot of this. I watch them once in a while to just check in and make sure they're still up to what I think they're up to. And they are.
It's not as bad as I think when I watch Fox,
Mhm.
but as bad as I think is Radioactive, like nonstop. And it's like, no, it takes 10 minutes for them to say, like, for me to go, okay, that's what I expected.
Well, I've noticed they have some exiles too. I mean, people who jump that ship and
Yes,
and try to make the great leap into legitimate journalism. And some of them make it, and some of them just can't.
a lot of them can't because,
No.
yeah, once once you've ridden that, once you've ridden on that horse, yeah, that you're no longer.
So we'll just have to hope for the best here. But I'm very gratified by the numbers voting. Almost 60 million people have now voted, which is almost half of the number that voted, not quite half, but almost the number that voted in 2016.
And we
At
still
the
have a
end,
little
by
more
the
than
end,
a week
yeah, we have more than a
of
week.
early
So
voting.
the long lines and the persistence and the determination, and especially the young people that I meet, they are very principled and very conscious, socially aware, and they're thinking for themselves, and they're going to vote this time. I predict you'll have a record number of young voters. actually going to the polls. And I think that time of young people don't vote is over, because now
Mhm.
they see a future imperiled, and they know that they are the ones who are going to have to live through most of it, while those who are making the decisions on their behalf from our generations will no longer be here. And so I have great faith in this generation. I'm still teaching full time, and I've gotten to know the Z's. I tease them that they're the last generation. They say they sometimes realize that, but I think they're the most uh, interesting and pragmatic and I would say focused young people I've taught in a long time.
You're teaching them poetry, I assume.
Yeah, I run the Lateness seminar at Georgetown University, and we bring poets and writers, and they have dinners with them and conversations and readings and discussions. And we're now Zooming it all, which isn't quite as exciting, but it's been better than I thought it would be. So yeah, I teach, and they come. The Lannan Fellows come from across the campus. They can be doctoral students or freshmen. They can be in the college, or they can be in one of the professional schools. They come from School of Foreign Service often, and they all are in the classroom together. These different ages and different uh, in different parts of their college career. And it's the only time on campus that this happens. But I make them write. And at first, some of them are afraid of that because they thought they were just going to meet writers. But I make them do their own writing, and they just open up. They fall in love with it. It's been really wonderful. The parents aren't too happy when they change their majors. but, uh, but that doesn't happen all the time. But when it does happen, that is a little bit of a problem. And someone leaves the School of Foreign Service to become a poet. The
You're
parents,
the best kind of bad influence, Carolyn.
yeah, I would say that, yeah.
Well, and what excites me about what you're talking about is how poetry seems to be touching people who, you know, are not necessarily what I call literary monsters. It took me a couple of years and just two great teachers to actually let me know, oh, one, literature isn't just boring stuff that you look for symbols in. And instead it's this like really vibrant thing that, like every time you read a really great book, it gets better.
Mhm.
But also that there were people who were still doing this. Um,
That was a
and
revelation to me when I was young, because I thought there was a time when I actually thought I might be the only person still doing this.
I was in a workshop with Susan Mitchell, and I was introduced to all of these poets who were still writing, and it was so exciting. Like I had this literary jukebox of all this amazing stuff, and I, you know, uh, I'm happy to say I've never quite recovered. I did take a good 15 years off of writing poetry. That was my first great humanitarian act. But I also feel like when I came back to writing poetry, and it's what I needed, was to write with a sense of humility, but also let's just have some fun and see what I can get on the page. And I did that when I was at NYU because I had to teach a basic writing class. And even though I was there to study fiction,
Mhm.
I had to teach, we were workshopping poetry and fiction. I'm like, well, I can't have them writing poetry and then, like a slime ball, not be writing poetry of my own. So I'm like, okay, let me put my poem out there. And yeah, it stuck. So to me, it's uh
Did you leave fiction?
no, not at all.
No.
I think my prose tend to be so purple that I was kind of already bringing poetry into what I was doing with my
Mhm.
fiction. But it was kind of joyful writing bad poetry again, but working on it until it got better. And to me, that's in some ways, that is the best part of writing, is watching, like feeling a poem from the inside and just loving it, and nurturing it until it grows into something that maybe isn't a demo tape that I need to keep hidden away.
Well, you were very, very fortunate to study with Susan Mitchell. She's an extraordinary poet. Really.
Absolutely.
She's one of my favorite American poets. She's truly exceptional.
uh Her poems are full of surprises.
They are. They are. They're radiant. They're really something. I met her years ago at Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center, and she's the real thing. Yeah.
Does your teaching influence your writing at all?
I'm sure it does, because all the preparation I do for the teaching, all the reading and all the thinking about the work, and also all the when I talk to students about their work, I'm actually teaching them what possibilities suggest themselves, but also how to
Mhm.
revise. And the more you revise anything, whether it's your work or someone else's work, the more facility you develop with it, you get better at it. So I think what happens with the classroom for me is that I'm always refreshed by the students, because they are of another generation and they get further and further away from me in age as the years go by. But I need them now to keep me in the present, because I would have a tendency to live in the past somewhat. And so I get that from them. And also I get practice with revision. Um, and, the more you practice it, the better it gets for you, the more obvious things become, and the more you develop strategies for seeing the work clearly and from different angles. So yes, I do think the only thing that is a drawback is, of course, time. You're spending teaching, you're not writing. But it does have, I think it's very enriching to be a teacher of writing and be writing.
Yeah, if I didn't need to get paid, I might do it for free, but I would probably do it a little bit less than I'm doing it now.
I find, yeah, I do it for free too, for free and for pay. But it's very enriching. It's quite a life to live inside the literary art, to live within it.
And it's easy to lose that, I think. Or at least it's been easy for me to lose that. Like, uh, to try and feel like mentally I am in it. Um,
I think you need community, at least even a small community. And I think with this series that you have of interviews, I think must help you to feel in community.
oh yeah, this
Because you
was
talk
a
to everyone.
result.
Yeah.
uh, well, yeah, this podcast started 2 years after I finished my MFA.
Hmm.
And when I finished the MFA, my gruff attitude was, thank God that's over. I can't wait to stop talking to those people. Not, I the idea that I had to talk about art and creative writing all the time was, after so much intimate years together, it feels like an irritant. And then a year and a half went by, and it's like, oh, those conversations I was too good for. I wonder if there's any way I
And go
can
back.
go back. And so,
Or
yeah,
recreate
this
them in some way, in
this
some.
podcast is my continuing MFA.
Yeah. Yeah.
I get to have those conversations, and uh, I learn a lot from the conversations, and just as much I learn from reading the work. You know, um,
Mm.
uh, Often I just have theories about people's work that I come by through reading, and then I get to ask them my theories, and I feel very spoiled because most people don't get to do that. Uh, and also, yeah, like, this is how it works for me. Does it work for you like that?
Okay.
And um, I'll never be the poet you are. So just hearing how it works for you, and most of the great writers I know also, there's a humility to the work, and they understand, like they could see every error, and it doesn't always feel magical for them.
It's, it is mysterious, the whole process. You know, I think it remains mysterious for me. And I know that it probably isn't mysterious. There's probably an explanation for how these things arrive on the page. And maybe something is happening at high speed and I can't, but it is a mystery and I need that in my life.
There's probably a math there, but it's probably really complicated. Also, yeah, I think for me, as a writer, a lot of it is just sitting with a mystery. Some of my projects, like I have one or two little nuggets of inspiration or light or something. Like there's something there, like I know it. And that may not be ready yet. There may not be enough accumulated there. And sometimes what is required is just throw yourself in upside down. But sometimes you just have to wait and you have to be patient and you have to think about it. You have to let the mystery just sit there sometimes and not worry about when this will be published or when this will be finished. And instead just sit with it, kind of like your story from The Boatman, where it took a while for that to arrive and there was no guarantee that it would. So for me, I try and think of different ways to describe the writing process, and sitting with a mystery for me is a pretty big part of it.
Well, Marilyn Robinson calls it dreaming on paper. And we have very tenuous relationship to control in our dreams. Sometimes we can try to guide the dream in a certain direction, but dreams are not to be guided usually. So dreaming on paper is, I think, a lovely way to put it.
Maybe you could guide yourself in the dream, but not necessarily guide the dream.
Yeah, the dream does what it wants. Yeah. Especially COVID dreams, which we're having now. They're very intense. Yeah.
At the risk of sounding dumb, was it sad to write so many elegies?
It was sad to lose my friends, but it wasn't sad to write. I feel wonderfully, I feel a joy when I write, especially when I get something that feels like it's there. So no, I'm sure there's sadness embodied in the poems, but I don't suffer when I write them. There's suffering. The suffering precedes the writing. And it's the suffering everyone has, whether they write or not, when they lose someone. I've lost a lot of people. I still consider myself young for some bizarre reason, because I'm not at all young, but I've lost a lot of friends who died before their life expectancy over the years.
So I wonder if you'd be willing to read Elegy for an Unknown Poet.
This is a poem for such a friend. There are several for him in this book, and his name is Daniel Simcoe, and he has a poetry book called The Arrival, which is published by Four Ways Press. He worked in the New York Public Library. He and his family were from the Bardiev, the village that my father's family is from in Slovakia, outside, not too far from Bratislava. But it was a small place when Daniel left it. And we met, and it was unusual to meet someone from the same town, in Slovakia. We became best friends, and he was working on Trakl translations. He was translating Hölderlin and Heine and Trakl, and he got very absorbed in the Trakl, and his translations of Trakl, Autumn Sonata, were also published, and they're very beautiful translations And he stayed with us in various places while he was working on it. And so I'm addressing him in this poem, but midway through the poem, Daniel becomes Trockel. The story of Trockel is an Austrian poet who was placed in charge of 90 wounded men in the First World War, in Galicia, I believe. And he was a pharmacist, and he had no way of helping these wounded. And eventually, he was driven mad by it. Elegy for an Unknown Poet. You who were apart, wanderer, stranger, who bent down in winter for the lost glove of another. You are ein Fremder on earth, as if you had been written toward us. Listen, bells. You are sheltered once again in the stillness of childhood, where the slow river remains, rain singing from a gutter spout, wet bottles, misted grill work. Apartness gathers the music of solitude as if it were a glass viola. Bells ring that are and are not, and the soul is left wandering in the blue night. You are the one watching, the one dreaming this, the homeless one left behind. The soul has departed, thinking, alone with your thoughts, the poverty of waking life, here where it nears the eternal. A man stood behind you holding a knife. You walked into the lake until only your hat could be seen. The dead began to wander quietly in the hall of stars. Your sister took her life, and then you couldn't bear the gaze of others. What you could bear, and for long hours, were the star-filled eyes of a toad. I am your translator. Pity me. It is impossible to slip ein Fremder into the mouth of another. Last summer, I went with you to the crematorium. We said poems and covered your body with gloves and roses. I know that you are dead. Why do you ask and ask what can be done? Black is the color of footsteps, frost, stillness, and tears. It modifies branches and wings. Blue appears as cloud, flower, ice. Deer stepping from the forest are also blue. A river is green, but green as well are flecks of decomposition. Silver the blossoming poppies, a wind's voice, faces of the unborn. The living, you say, appear unreal to you, as if they were on fire. Yet the living gaze at the dead, imploring them to appear. Why, you ask? The living are oblivious to what they are, measuring time as the flickering of day and night. Brown are the cesspools, rafters, and shadows, golden the day, candles and a tent of stars, ivory the hands and limbs of lovers, purple a night wind, nostrils and snails. A skiff is red, as are wolf and wound, yellow are the walls of summer. Sleep is white, as is sickness, shirt, and revenant. What is left us then but darkness? One's self is always dark and near. Ein Fremder is a stranger. Yeah. And that comes from Trockel too. The idea of being a stranger on earth, being not at home not at home.
Yeah, that's
It's an idea of exilic being, of being exiled within yourself, whether you are exiled from a country or not.
I'm actually writing an essay on that very topic myself.
Oh, you are good. Yeah.
Perhaps this is ironic, or perhaps I just need to respect certain people more, but there's a Kurt Weill song with lyrics by Ogden Nash called I'm a Stranger Here Myself about the impossibility and madness of love, which I wouldn't have thought that Ogden Nash would have penned like some of my favorite lyrics of all time, but he has.
Good.
And I probably just need to go deeper into Ogden Nash to find that, maybe the childish rhymes is, maybe there's more than that. There's probably a lot more than that. Yeah, and so there's a certain friction with the foreign words for foreigner in there, and that's one of the things I notice about this collection is how the challenge to the reader sparkles rather than being a constant challenge. The language of most of this collection is plain, expertly placed so that there's definitely like this musicality to it, and it's almost ethereally concrete, the poems in this collection. But there are moments where there's just a word that, all right, you're going to have to look that up if you're going to actually get the poem. And there's something about that I love, that uh there's just enough of a challenge to make me pause and to make me spend more time with the book and to reacquaint me with my dictionary, which um I it makes me feel young actually to do that.
Yeah.
um so I wonder if that was something that you were thinking about when you were revising the book, or if that goes into the way that you think about the voice of the work.
Are you referring to the occasional word or phrase in another language?
Or just unusual phrases in English.
I've mixed it up with other languages a lot. I mean, I've lived in several different languages, and I grew up with different languages spoken in the house. My father and grandmother and others spoke Slovak. She could also speak Hungarian. And anyway, this mysteriousness, of growing up around a language that was at once meaningful and sometimes more musical than meaningful as I was learning it or picking it up. And yeah, so I have an idiolect. I have peculiar phrasings anyway of speech that come from my childhood, that sometimes people point out to me, that my syntax is a little different. It's not wrong, it's just strange. So once I let that be on the page, that created a kind of energy in the poems. And when I use a word or phrase from another language, it's either because in some sense it's not really translatable to an equivalent, and sometimes it just signals a kind of otherness to the poem, and it will let the reader know, that the poem is elsewhere or coming from elsewhere. And sometimes I get a magical series of words, and sometimes even I don't know what they quite mean, and I leave them alone. I have this one phrase in a poem toward the end of the book, which is really, I don't know where it came from, and I couldn't take it out. I just couldn't. It was called, it's a poem called Toward the End, and the phrase is, were it not for the weather of trance of haze and murk. Who knows what the weather of haze and murk is, but I thought, okay, hazy, murky weather, we can leave it there. But I liked the music of it, so I just left it alone.
Well, and part of the job of poetry is to create language.
Yeah, you have to you have to make the language new, and there's so much going on when you're writing poetry. There's so much going on, and meaning is happening on so many levels, including the sonic level. And if you're line breaking, if you're lineating, then you're also playing the line against the syntax, and you're playing with pauses and white space, and then you have all the patternings of the consonants and the vowels, and then you have the patterning of the stresses in English, you know, stressed syllables. And there's so much happening all at once. And then there's the level of, and this is something that's important to me, because sometimes with my students, I have to get them across this bridge, this gap. And the gap is from simply telling the story, or simply narrating an event, or simply giving voice to something that happened, to allowing the portals in that story or in that language to open up to a larger sense, a larger meaning, or a deeper meaning, or an alignment with mythology, or to find out what else, where that takes you. Because for me, it's not quite enough to give voice to an event, or to a memory, or to an observation. It has to have a frisson, a little, a kind of spark of recognition and discovery.
To use an old-fashioned term, a turn, although
Yeah.
it seems like a turn towards transformation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think of the Colonel, where I don't think that happens, but that's because what you're writing about is so terrible that uh, I think of Hemingway, who just said, like, you can't describe war and have it like, he said, just say places and names.
Right. Just the facts. In other words, that poem had to stay spare because it was so horrific that it couldn't be, you couldn't add anything to it. So that had to stay flat. And it wasn't written as a poem. I wrote it as prose. In fact, it wasn't even written to be prose. It was written to be notes so that I would remember everything. It was a litany of details. So then it wound up in a poetry manuscript. And when it was published, it was singled out as this poem, and then I had to account for it as a poem. But it wasn't a poem, it wasn't born a poem. It came from a completely different species.
So even as a poet who has a very definite aesthetic and way of working, you have to be open to sometimes the opposite of
Yeah.
what your instincts are, to serve the poem or to serve the spirit of whatever it is.
Yeah, that's right. And it's just to get people to relax and trust, to trust, to take the leap, to just start writing and trust. That's a very hard thing. It can't be learned any more than the baby bird can learn to fly before it leaves the branch. I tell them, you're baby birds, you're all lined up on the branch. It's time to fly. Your mama cannot take you into the sky for the first time on her back or something. You have to go by yourself. And that involves jumping off the branch. So that's how
you could study the film, but until you jump off the branch.
That's right. You have to jump, and then you have to flap your wings all the way down.
And try not to land on your head.
Yeah.
But maybe don't try too hard. So you mentioned earlier What Comes. I was wondering if you would be willing
Oh,
to.
yeah. So what comes? Well, this was the one that I wrote when I was in chemotherapy. And I was in another place altogether. And I think I talked myself into being all right by writing this. And it begins with an epigraph by René Char, who was a member of the French Resistance and a poet, 20th century. I brought from despair a basket so light, my love, that it might have been woven of willow. René Char. To speak is not yet to have spoken, the not yet of a white realm of nothing left, neither for itself nor another, a no longer already there, along with the arrival of what has been, light and the reverse of light, terror as walking blind along the breaking sea, body in whom I lived, the not yet of death, darkening what it briefly illuminates, an unknown place, as between languages, back and forth, breath to breath, as a calm in the surround rises, fireflies in lindens, an ache of pine. You have yourself within you, yourself, you have her, and there is nothing that cannot be seen. Open then to the coming of what comes.